What does a bicycle factory that produces 1 million bikes a year look like? We are here in Dajia in Taiwan, about to get a tour of exactly that. Guiding us on our tour today is Andrew Deskytis, Senior Marketing Manager, who's been with Giant for 20 years at this point.
Yeah.
Briefly, what are the 5 steps that we're looking at here?
Build menus.
Giant Factory.
Great. We start off with the loom room, where we start from bare thread, where we actually weave our own composite sheet. From that, we actually go to the cutting room, where each of those sheets are cut into specific sizes, 270 to be specific. From that, we go to per frame. From that, we go to the layup room, where actually two of those 270 pieces, they're laid up by hand into the shape of the TCR Advanced SL. From that, we go into the molding room, where those molds are actually formed, where the heat and the pressure are combined to actually produce the frame. And then from that, we go to the assembly room, where the actual bicycles are assembled. So you'll see 5 key steps of the TCR Advanced SL production.
Going from thread to
putting the
complete
bike
frame
in a box.
to putting a complete bike in a box. Big process. Thanks for
it. Is. All right, so let's start things off. You are now in the loom room. This is where we create our own composite sheet. I'm going to walk you through the steps that it takes to create our own composite sheet. Before I do that, I wanted to say this, and this is a very important point to understand. We're the only major manufacturer in the world who takes this step. If you were to get into other factories, you would see them buying the composite sheet from other factories made already. We take this extra step to make sure that we make our own composite sheet. Like I said before when I gave the introduction, we control the process all the way from the bare thread, literally, to the finished frame. So this is where it begins here. What we're doing in this room is effectively creating a high-tech sandwich. In order to create that sandwich, we need to make the bread, those 2 outer sides. This is the cover sheet. You can see behind me where the resin is impregnated into the cover sheet. The 2 cover sheets come together with the resin inside of it, right? Seems like a pretty simple process. It's taken us years to perfect it. So not only is the resin custom blended for our specific use for this particular application at this particular hour on this particular cover sheet, we control the process all the way. The reason we do it like this now is to ensure supreme accuracy. We don't want more resin here and more resin there. We want a uniform layer of resin sandwiched between the cover sheets. Very, very important, because we're about to take the next step where the cover sheet is joined with the raw carbon thread. This is where the sandwich is made. This is where the outer sheet, the resin, and the actual raw carbon material come together to form our actual composite sheet. So please do take a look. You'll see up to 64 rolls of Toray composite material. To be clear, that carbon material, that raw carbon material, there are 5 sources on this planet. We source primarily from Toray, which is a Japanese manufacturer. Extremely difficult to manufacture carbon material. Super, super high tech. That's really the only thing that we would subcontract or buy. But you can see up to 64 looms are threaded very carefully through the loom machine, where it's all, you can see the floor down here, where it all comes together into a very straight arrangement. This is an important point that I'm about to talk about. You can see the carbon thread is heading in one direction. This creates unidirectional carbon sheet, right? All the threads are in one direction. And this is a really important fact to note, because as we see the production of the bicycles, it's very important to understand the layup schedule. That schedule is how exactly that sheet is laid up in which direction. So right now, everything's heading in one direction, and that's the way we want it to be. It is sandwiched between the cover sheets that we just saw being impregnated with resin. It's creating a very fancy high-tech carbon sandwich right here. The machine uses high heat and high pressure to make sure that that resin is propagated throughout the carbon material in a very specific manner. It's very important we get even coverage. That all happens in the machine behind. The carbon thread is threaded through here, goes into the cover sheets, into the high heat, into the high pressure, and comes out at the end. So let's walk along the machine and see how that process happens. You want to kind of hold the actual process that is happening through high heat and pressure here. You want to make sure that it's stable. So let's walk through really the last process. We're actually going to go in. Come on in, guys. Walk on in. Editors, please walk on in. Get in there.
Well,
Temperature control.
hold me.
So it's 12 degrees below zero in here, guys. We have a 15 to 30 day supply of carbon material. It needs to be below freezing in order to keep it steady and constant. Right?
It's cold in here.
Yeah. This keeps it stable. If we left it at room temperature or somewhere around room temperature, it could start to kind of activate and kind of melt on its own. So we want to freeze, effectively freeze the carbon.
How many bikes are in there?
15 to 30 day supply in here, that's a lot of bikes.
Jeez.
And there's multiple freezers, you're standing in one. So we're in the dynamic testing room, and in this room is constantly operating testing products. Unique to today, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we are exclusively testing TCR Advanced SL. Everything has to meet our specifications. One of the specifications that we live up to, right, and everybody else does, is ISO standards. And ISO standards are fairly strict when it comes down to fatigue testing for frames, certainly with forks, C-posts even. In this room, everything that is tested in this room, whether it's our new high-tech mountain bike or TCR Advanced SL, is 20% over ISO standard. That builds in a margin of safety and quality that only Giant adheres to. I can't speak to other manufacturers, but 20% over ISO standard sets an extremely high level of quality for all of our products that leave this factory. So no, not every frame we produce gets tested here, because they're usually tested to failure, but a selection is. There are 4 steps to testing, and I just want to make sure and get them right. We start off with engineering testing, development testing, pre-production testing, and mass production testing. Every single composite fork that leaves this factory gets inspected in the manner you see in front of me before it leaves this factory. Every single fork. As a result of that, this room is functioning, manned, and operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, obviously to keep up with demand. It's quite a laborious process to make sure that every fork doesn't have any imperfections in it. That's bubbles or wrinkles in the layup process, because obviously a fork security is so incredibly important as well.
Does that apply to the other 30% of... Is those Giant forks only, or is that all forks that are leaving?
These are all forks that leave this factory, because safety is such an important concern, not just for our brand, but for every site.
Everybody likes their teeth.
Everybody likes their teeth, and as you know better than anyone. We've been testing every fork since this room's been in operation. This room's been in operation for about 8 years now.
Wow, that is good.
Fairly new process. You can see how laborious it is. I mean, there's one operator. What does that take? About 3-4 minutes to test each fork. You can see on the screen here, he's looking for any imperfections in the overall integrity of the fork, including the steerer tube. It's a lot of work, and you can't just set it on its own.
As is done around the world, Giant takes sheets of carbon and cuts them into pieces with which to build frames. There are 3 processes for this inside Giant. 1, mechanical stamping. 2, robotic laser cutting. And then 3, the new robotic knife cutting that Giant calls cold cutting. We can't show you this part, but Giant says the laser cutting leads to a tiny amount of heat deformation, which this new process avoids. This new process is only used for the TCR Advanced SL, which represents a very small portion of the total carbon bikes.
So guys, we are in the frame layup room. And this is really the key, the pinnacle of the tour, I would say. Because what you can see in here is unique in the sense that, number one, they're building TCR Advanced SL. But really what I want to drive home is the handmade process. This is incredibly laborious. Number two, what I wanted to point out is you can see the front triangle is one single part. We mentioned that yesterday in the product presentation. Because the triangle is one single part, uses a single piece mold, or the actual bladder inside. You can see the white plastic bladder. That is a one-piece internal mold that is new technology to Giant. It creates that one-piece front triangle, which we can use larger pieces that can be placed more accurately, minimizing the weight where we don't want it, and increasing stiffness where we do. You'll take special note down at the bottom bracket area. That obviously is kind of the heart of the frame. That's critical to remove the right amount of material, but not the too much material. Also, we talked about unidirectional carbon prepreg. You can see the material, how it goes in a very specific, we call it a layup schedule. The direction of the composite has a tremendous effect on the overall performance of the frame. The way it's laid, how many layers it's sandwiched, and actual what direction, from a straight perpendicular layup to a 45-degree layup. It can change the overall performance of the frame. But you can see the amount of handwork that goes into each of these frames. In the summertime, they make sure that this is fairly air conditioned to keep the temperature, again, as we had that question earlier on, as manageable as possible. Because once the carbon material leaves that freezer, the clock is kind of ticking on its lifespan. So we need to make sure and get it cut properly, laid up properly, and put it in the mold as soon as possible to produce the finished product. The hairdryer warms up the material just enough, because if it came out of the freezer, it would be like a rock. So they need to make it malleable, or able to be formed. So a little bit of heat kind of makes it sticky and makes it softer before it goes into the molding process.
Okay, and
these are frame molds. Each steel mold is about $75,000 to $100,000 per mold. So you wonder, once we're locked into a geometry, why can't we change the geometry? A lot of tooling invested in that. That's the molding process itself, where heat and pressure are added to the frames, and the frames come out of those molds. It's hot in there.
Since this tour was focused on the new TCR Advanced SL construction process, we did not get to see the frames coming out of the mold to be finished and painted. Instead, the tour jumped to the complete bike assembly, where dozens of workers put the bikes together on an assembly line.
Those finishing touches are all done here, loaded in shipping containers, off to the port, and then around the world. Normal travel time for a bike, let's say, it's loaded up here in a shipping container, it's off to Amsterdam. A little under 2 months before it gets to the port of Amsterdam. Los Angeles is 6 weeks.
so thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Giant, for that tour of parts of this massive facility here in Dajia, Taiwan, one of 9 factories that Giant operates around the world. We showed you what we were allowed to show. There's some other bits that were kept under wraps, but hopefully that gave you some basic idea of how much work and detail and technology and people power goes into every single one of these frames that's coming out of this Giant factory. Make sure you check out my other videos on the news and first ride impressions of this new TCR Advanced SL0 and my big ride north of Taipei, following the Taipei show. As always, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you subscribing. Whether you're riding a bike that's coming out of this factory or somewhere else around the world, I hope you enjoy the ride.